Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? The camera focuses tightly on an old gold locket, resting on a rough, work-worn palm, the cold Boston winter light reflecting dully off the metal. The hand belonging to Sarah trembles slightly as her fingers close over it with a painful familiarity. The outside world falls silent, reduced only to the sound of a soft click as she finally opens the piece. Inside, there is no picture, but a tiny recording device that begins to play, a young woman's voice, soft and almost ethereal, singing an eerie, familiar lullaby, a melody of just a few notes that sounds like a private prayer. The voice is sweet, but the impact on Sarah's face is crushing. Her deep, tired eyes instantly fill with a grief she'd carried for 3 decades. She had spent 30 years looking for the truth, a truth they had tried to bury beneath paperwork and institutional indifference. But the one piece of evidence, the single, unassailable proof of a life stolen, was not a document at all. It was hidden, perfectly, within a tune. They told her the child was gone, a tragedy of the low-class wards at St. Jude's, and the world expected her, the humble nurse, to simply grieve and forget. But how do you forget the life you never held? Sarah's life is a portrait of silent sacrifice at the community clinic, a place of faded walls and uncomfortable chairs, where she dispensed empathy and relief to the underserved, yet never to herself. She was the nurse who stayed late, whose hands tended to wounds the Boston healthcare system ignored, while her own wound, the loss of her daughter 30 years ago, remained raw and throbbing. The memory of the elite hospital, the St. Jude's, where her baby was declared stillborn, was a marble and silence-filled specter that contrasted painfully with her reality, institutional coldness against the weary warmth of her dedication. Her routine was her only anchor against existential emptiness. The scent of rubbing alcohol and weak coffee, the morning light filtered through cracked blinds, and the repetition of caring gestures that masked her relentless search. She never bought the death story, not when the pain was so palpable, so immediate, and so conveniently concealed by the rich hospital's bureaucracy. All that remained for her was the locket and the silent stubbornness that the truth, like the melody, couldn't be destroyed, only temporarily silenced. She just needed the right catalyst, the exact slip-up, for the whole foundation of lies to finally crack and reveal her daughter's face. The catalyst arrived in the form of Mr. Henderson, 70s, a Boston titan, now reduced to a dying patient in a private hospital suite that made Sarah's community clinic feel like another planet. Sarah was assigned his temporary palliative care, a cruel irony. Henderson's room was the antithesis of Sarah's world, impersonally luxurious, suffocating silence, cold marble, and a panoramic view of a city he had conquered and that Sarah could only observe from the periphery. He treated her with a subtle, automatic disdain, the polished indifference that wealth affords, seeing her only as another humble cog in his expensive healthcare machine. The room was heavy with the air of finality, but Sarah performed her routine with her usual discretion, moving through the shadows. That's when she heard it. Not the beeping of the machine or the murmur of oxygen, but a clear, almost ethereal female voice, coming from a darker corner of the room. Lily, Henderson's granddaughter, successful, dressed in expensive clothes that felt like armor, was sitting by her grandfather, singing to him. She had an air of subtle, permanent sadness in her eyes, the silent melancholy of one who achieved everything but feels something essential is missing. Time stopped. Lily's voice was nearly identical to the locket's recording, but the melody was the exact one Sarah had recorded in the locket, the one her own mother and grandmother sang to her, a specific arrangement, with a pause on the fourth note and a dissonant final chord, which had been exclusive to her humble family for generations. That sound was an auditory DNA that couldn't be copied or mistaken. The lullaby, the stolen lullaby, resonated in the marble room, shattering Sarah's composure. She froze with a cotton swab in her hand, her breath catching in her throat. Sarah felt a physical shock, a wave of heat that rose from her stomach and paralyzed her arms. Reason screamed it was impossible, a cruel coincidence, but Sarah's body, trained for the truth of life and death, instantly recognized it. That was her melody, and that woman, with the same subtle look of bereavement as Sarah, could only be hers. Lily finished a melody, the silence filling the room like a confession. She looked up at Sarah, feeling the abnormal intensity of the nurse's gaze, an unspoken connection, a moment of mystery that chilled the air between them. Lily, uneasy with Sarah's fixation, muttered sharply, "Is there a problem, nurse?" Her voice was authoritative, accustomed to being obeyed, but Sarah couldn't answer, only shook her head, forcing the tears back, her face becoming a mask of tense professionalism. The mystery was not who Lily was, but how she had learned that melody. Sarah left the room with her mind racing, clutching the locket in her pocket, the metal hot against her skin, now transformed from a symbol of mourning into an instrument of justice. The routine was broken. The search, which was once an internal whisper, had become a storm. Back in the familiar chill of her modest apartment, which smelled of old lavender and stale paper, Sarah tried to resist and rationalize. She sat in her worn armchair, the sound of Boston traffic the only noise besides the deafening beat in her chest. "It's just a song, Sarah. Millions of songs. A common folk tune," she whispered to the blurry reflection in the window. But the lie found no echo. Her body, trained in years of silence and restraint, now betrayed her with a cold that came from within, an urgency she hadn't felt since the day they told her daughter had died. She tried to delve into clinic reports, but Lily's handwriting, which she had glimpsed on an admission form, haunted the page. It wasn't a coincidence. The melody was a genetic link, a whisper from the past that ignored logic. She got up and went to the dresser, pulling out an old, faded photo of her mother, the family matriarch, who had taught her the song. Looking at the picture, an old phrase came back to her with the force of a punch. "This song, Sarah, it's only for us." It carries the weight of all the women who sang it. That phrase, which at the time was just family superstition, now felt like a prophetic mandate. The locket, which she placed atop the photo, became a magnetic compass pointing to the truth. She tried again to convince herself it was madness. A humble nurse challenging the memory of one of the richest men in the state. What would she gain? To be accused of intrusion, of greed. She could already feel the anticipated judgment of Boston society labeling her a fortune hunter, a hysteric. This resistance, however, was only the fear of failing again, the fear of reliving the original grief. Guilt began to manifest as a physical weight on her shoulders. "I should have fought harder that day. I should have screamed. I should never have trusted them." The memories of the poor hospital, the hurried nurse, the record she never saw, all pushed her forward. The only way to calm the inner turmoil was not to ignore it, but to confront the wound. She picked up the phone, her hands sweaty. She needed help. This game wasn't played in the ward, but in the back channels of bureaucracy and family secrets. She remembered Sam, a colleague from the clinic, a kind older man, who was a former amateur genealogy detective, who loved old puzzles and had access to more obscure databases. That was the trigger, the line of action that broke the inertia. The smell of hospital on her clothes, now mixed with the scent of incense in her room, was a palpable contrast between her life of service and the private war she was about to declare. She wasn't fighting for money. She was fighting for recognition, for identity, for the simple justice of a blood tie that had been forcibly severed. The song, again, began to play in her mind, louder than the voice of reason, pushing her onto the emotional investigation journey. She sent Sam a message. "I need you to find a missing link." 30 years ago, St. Jude's Hospital. A patient called Lily. Sarah's journey became a discreet, agonizing climb against the wall of Boston's elite. Her first attempt was at the hospital records, where she still worked occasionally, but access was systematically blocked. Every time she tried to enter the old archives wing, a password system or a polite security guard stopped her. The narrator emphasized, every closed door only confirmed her deepest fear. The system hadn't just buried a body, it had buried a secret, a truth so corrosive it needed 3 decades of silence to protect it. The poor don't get answers, they get explanations. This initial tension was the first mini cliffhanger. Sam, her colleague and now silent accomplice, was working behind the scenes, trawling genealogy databases and old news articles about the Henderson family. In a cafe in a modest neighborhood, Sarah and Sam met under fluorescent lights, spending hours in tense silence, only the sound of coffee brewing filling the air. Sam handed her a first piece of paper, a newspaper article from the time. Lily's adoption by Henderson's sterile daughter was celebrated as a miracle of charity, a carefully orchestrated story. The report omitted the child's origin. They scrubbed the records clean, Sarah. Too perfect, Sam whispered, the tension rising with each discovery. The pressure mounted when Sarah had to care for Mr. Henderson again. She was in his room, trying to appear just a nurse, but her eyes searched for any clue. That's when Lily entered, her armor of success tighter than ever. She was tense, feeling Sarah's gaze. Nurse, I don't appreciate your lingering presence here. You've been asking too many odd questions to the staff. Lily confronted her, directly accusing her of being a fortune hunter taking advantage of a dying man. Sarah, confronted and falsely accused, felt the pain of tripled injustice, the loss, the lie, and the judgment. She stopped wiping a dresser, turned slowly, and in a moment of pure emotion and defiance, whispered the second part of the melody, the part she was sure Lily would never have sung in public. She saw shock and denial cross Lily's face. Lily's look shifted from anger to a disturbed confusion, a crack in her facade. Where did you hear that? Lily demanded, her voice low and dangerous. Sarah maintained her silence, letting the melody speak for her, creating the second emotional cliffhanger. Sarah knew she needed a proof that would dismantle the lie with visual force. She pleaded with Sam for something stronger than the song. Days later, Sam met her again, his face strained. He had tracked down an elderly former doctor from St. Jude's maternity ward at the time, who had retired abruptly. The doctor was being cared for at a charity clinic, and in a moment of confession, he had given Sam a scanned copy of a hastily scribbled old note, the strong visual evidence. The note, which Sam carefully placed in Sarah's trembling hands, was a yellowed, crumpled piece of paper with hurried, almost illegible handwriting, but the message was clear. The child is healthy, adopted by H. Discreetly, the poor one must be silenced with the lie. The H matched Henderson. The note was the weapon, the unassailable proof of systemic manipulation. The narrator focused on Sarah's trembling hand holding the paper, the truth no longer a hope, but a terrifying responsibility. Now armed with the note and the locket, Sarah prepared for the final confrontation. She managed to slip into Mr. Henderson's room on her last shift, when Lily had stepped out for an emergency meeting. The room was dark and tense, the machine sounding like a requiem. She was alone with the man who had stolen her life. The ethical dilemma to tell the truth to a dying man was overwhelming, but the urgency of justice propelled her. She placed the open note on Henderson's nightstand. Mr. Henderson, Sarah began, her voice surprisingly steady. I know about the lie. I know about the adoption. And I know the initials H stand for you. She took the locket, opened it, and let the lullaby play in the solemn silence, the sound sweet and eerily familiar. The dying man, lying on his death throne, opened his eyes slightly, recognition and guilt flooding his pale face. The major cliffhanger, the confrontation is interrupted by the door bursting open. Lily returned unexpectedly. She saw Sarah, the note, the locket playing the melody, and the expression of confession and dread on her grandfather's face. The room froze in a triangle of pain, truth, and denial. The investigation was over. The climax had begun. The room was plunged into an oppressive silence, interrupted only by the rhythmic beep of the life support machines and the faint melody of Sarah's locket. Lily, standing in the doorway, looked like she had taken a physical blow. Her face was a mask of denial and disbelief. What is the meaning of this, nurse? Get out now, she growled, the voice of authority feeling tinged with fear. But Sarah didn't move, her eyes fixed on the dying man. Mr. Henderson, gathering the last crumbs of his strength and dignity, made a guttural sound, a moan of confession and relief, his pleading eyes fixed on the humble nurse who had broken his empire of lies. He weakly gestured toward the note on the nightstand and toward Lily, unable to speak, yet communicating the weight of his guilt. The truth lay in the silent agony of a powerful man. Sarah acted. She knew words weren't necessary. She leaned over the deathbed, not in triumph, but in exhausted pity. "It was a forced adoption, Lily," she whispered, not to Henderson, but to the woman standing in the doorway. 30 years ago, your father, he needed an heir. They took her from a poor mother and fabricated the death. This song, it's the only thing that belongs to us." The song continued to play, the diegetic music being the only proof that mattered. Lily's turning point was physical. Her rigid posture crumbled. Denial morphed into a devastating realization. She moved toward Henderson's bedside, but not to comfort, to demand the truth with her eyes. The dying man coughed, struggling for a final breath. "Lily, I'm sorry," he managed to say, the hardest words of his life, a confession that weighed like a sentence. And then, the heart monitor sounded a continuous tone, the final silence descending upon the room. Lily didn't cry for the loss of her grandfather. She cried for the loss of the life she had been told. She turned to Sarah, her face flooded, no longer the defensive billionaire, but a woman stripped of her identity. She looked at the locket, at Sarah, and the pain in her chest was the silent confirmation Sarah had waited for. In that intimate moment, the barrier of 30 years was broken. The scene that followed was not one of shouting or squabbling over inheritance. It was a silent act of acceptance. Lily approached Sarah, no longer in accusation, but in naked vulnerability. She offered no money or elaborate apologies. She simply extended her hand, the gesture of a woman desperately looking for an anchor she never knew she needed. Sarah, the humble nurse who challenged an empire, looked into her lost daughter's eyes and saw herself. The payoff came not in the marble room, but in the hospital corridor, away from the machines and the wealth. Lily didn't say, "You are my mother." Sarah didn't say, "I found you." They simply shared an embrace that broke the barrier of 3 decades of injustice and grief. It was a tense, awkward hug between two strangers united by a common wound, but it held the warmth of a blood connection that the healthcare system and greed could never nullify. The embrace wasn't the end. It was the beginning. The final image is of Sarah and Lily, not in a lawyer's office or a mansion, but in a simple, cozy coffee shop, the scent of fresh bread and coffee replacing the smell of disinfectant. They sat side by side, the silence between them now comfortable, no longer hostile. The soft late afternoon light streamed through the window, illuminating Sarah's face with a peace she hadn't felt in 30 years. Together, they opened the gold locket. The melody of the lullaby, the stolen song, filled the small space, this time not as proof of pain, but as a testament to reunion. Their eyes met over the small symbolic object, a look that said everything that needed to be said about grief, truth, and the unbreakable power of the family bond. The injustice had been confronted, and the family, in a broken, beautiful way, was reunited, leaving the rest of life to be built in a future that began with a simple melody. What price would you pay to reclaim a stolen life? Share your thoughts below. If this story moved you, don't forget to like and share it with